Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. I want first, in the first 10 minutes, to give you a little bit of an overview over Japanese whaling history and the role Japan played in the IWC, so that we all have a basic understanding of the situation as it is today. First, a bit about the history of whaling in Japan. As you might know, Japan claims to have a very long whaling history. Some say about 9,000 years old, while other, mainly NGOs in Western countries, say that the Japanese whaling history is only about 100 years. Actually, it is more like about 400 years if we look at the written sources we have. So around 1570, we have the first whalers appearing in the Bay of Ise in central Japan. And from there, organized whaling was established in many parts of Western Japan with the so-called net whaling method. You can see it here on the map in the red places. And this was mainly done with large nets, which were used to drive whales into coves or to put them into these coves. And about 300 whalers were working together to hunt one single whale. And what is very interesting here is that only certain whale species could be hunted with this method, mainly right whales and other slow-moving whales, and faster whales and larger whales were not possible to be hunted. Nevertheless, some estimate that around 200,000 whales were killed in about 300 years of this traditional whaling history. At the end of the 19th century, this kind of whaling did die out in Japan because of overfishing or overwhaling in this case. So traditional Japanese whaling stopped around 1870, 1880. A few years later, in 1906, whaling was taken once up again with the introduction of industrial whaling, which was imported from Norway. And this is where modern whaling in Japan begins. It is estimated that here about 500,000 whales have been killed since 1906. Also, since 1934, the Japanese have entered the Antarctic in the Southern Sea and have conducted whaling there. And maybe one other very important date in Japanese whaling history is 1945. Japan lost the Second World War, as we all know. And while whaling had stopped during the war, after the war, Japan was occupied by the American forces, and they were allowed by the American forces to do whaling once again in the Antarctic in order to get whale meat to Japan, as there was a famine in Japan during this time. And this is the reason why many older Japanese today still think fondly of whale meat, as whale meat has saved many from starvation in 1945. So this is a very emotional topic for many Japanese at the time. Okay, so from 1945 until 1987, Japan was conducting three kinds of whaling, so-called small type coastal whaling. This was with rather small vessels, under 48 tons. They look like this. They were hunting minke whales, which are the smallest baleen whales. Also some other species, but these were the most important ones. Another type of whaling Japan continued until 1987 is large type coastal whaling, also at the Japanese coast, but with larger vessels, and also for larger whale species, for example, sperm whales. Finally, we have pelagic whaling, which is the most famous one. For example, the Antarctic whaling mission is pelagic whaling. Here we have these so-called floating factories, so a whole whaling fleet going somewhere in the world and bringing the whales onto the ships and processing the whales on ships, so no coastal station is needed for this. And here, main whales hunted are blue whales and other large whales, fin whales, sei whales, and so on. Then also very important for the story here is, of course, the IWC moratorium. As I said before, this was all until 1987, so something happened, obviously. The IWC is the International Whaling Commission, which was established in 1946. Japan joined a few years later in 1951. And originally the commission was an organization for whaling nations who put up restrictions among themselves so that the whale stocks would be protected, so that the industry could be sustainable for the future. So the commission was not founded to protect the whales for themselves, but for the whaling industry. In the 1960s, Japan became the largest whaling nation in the world, killing, as I said, around 500,000 whales, while other whaling nations like the US began to cease their own whaling industries and became more and more anti-whaling. And this also led to a development that more and more nations in the International Whaling Commission wanted to stop whaling altogether, while Japan and a few other countries, for example, Norway and Iceland, wanted to continue whaling. And in 1986, a so-called moratorium for commercial whaling came into effect. What is important to note about this is that that not all whale types were forbidden to hunt from this point on. Only large whales, so-called great whales, so baleen whales and sperm whales, while smaller whales and dolphins were not forbidden to be hunted. Also, there were some exceptions. For example, Aboriginal whaling was still allowed, and scientific whaling, also hunting whales for scientific purposes, and then selling the meat locally was also allowed. Japan did this, as you will be familiar, in the Antarctic. So for 30 years, the Japanese did go every year in the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean and did scientific whaling, which was very controversial for its whole runtime. And also, while large type coastal whaling was ceased in 1987, there was still some communities in Japan, 4 of them, Taichi, which you may also know from the dolphin hunts in the movie The Cove, and 3 other towns lesser known like Wadaura, Ayukawa, and Awashiri. All of these towns continued with small type coastal whaling, even though they were no longer allowed to hunt minke whales. They hunted smaller whale types like pilot whales and barred-beaked whales. Then in 2019, so last year, Japan withdrew from the IWC. They are still there as observers, but they are no longer a member state. And the consequence of this is that they reintroduced commercial coastal whaling. So in their own exclusive economic zone, Japan is now again hunting whales, especially minke whales. But in return, they have given up scientific whaling in the Antarctic, as hunting outside your own economic zone is only allowed if you are a member of the IWC. So we have now a quota, as you can see here. These are about 300 whales that Japan is now hunting every year, especially minke whales and bright whales, but also some sei whales. So this is the current situation at the moment. And with this, I think I will give back to Denise, and I'm open for questions.
To kick off the conversation, I would like to ask 1 or 2 general questions before talking in more detail about some of the geopolitical aspects. So Japan's aim until it left the International Whaling Commission, as you mentioned, was to resume commercial whaling. Also, once this moratorium on commercial whaling came into force, they conducted these research missions to the Antarctica and North Pacific, as you mentioned, despite heavy criticism from the international community. Could you give us a bit more background information on why whaling has been such a controversial and emotional topic in Japan if the sector hasn't been economically viable for a long time?
Yes, so this is a very difficult question, of course. And if you look at what the Japanese people say themselves, you see that most people in Japan do not eat whale meat. They do not have strong feelings about whaling itself. Besides the older generation, as I've mentioned, that some older generations still think very fondly of whale meat because they ate it in school cantinas in the 1940s and 50s. But most younger people are not really interested in whaling or whale meat or anything like this. However, they are very strongly emotionally connected if someone criticizes Japan because of their whaling program. Because for them, it seems like that the West wants to impose their norms and traditions onto Japan, on their food traditions, for example, or their perspectives. And for many Japanese, this is found very unfair, that the Japanese are told by the West which types of meat they can eat and which they can't eat. So they say that the Western nations are eating pork and chicken, and Japanese eat fish. So everyone should be allowed to eat whatever they want. So the Japanese people are not pro-whaling per se, but they are anti-whaling. So they're against anti-whaling movements. And that's why they are behind the government and are pro-leaving the IWC, for example.
So you mentioned in the 60s and 70s, America and Europe began to change the whaling discourse also because whale stock had decreased drastically and these first anti-whaling movements emerged. So back then, did Japan still depend on the whaling industry for food and economic development, or how come this discourse had not reached Japan?
Not really. So I think in around 1948 or something, around this time, about 47% of all proteins taken by the Japanese were actually whale meat, were coming from whale meat. So about half of all the proteins were whale meat. So in the 40s and 50s, you can really say whale meat was very important for the Japanese cuisine. But in the 60s and 70s, this had decreased drastically. And people were eating much more meat and fish than they were eating whale meat. So the food was no longer a factor that is considered here. It is puzzling why the discourse of protecting whales, which was very popular in the West, for example, with Flipper, the TV series, was never taken up in Japan. And there's not really an explanation why the Japanese never consumed the same TV series and so on, and never developed the same attitude towards whale than Western people did.
So in the 60s, 70s, as I said, the whale stock decreased drastically. Was Japan also affected by this? Were there actually enough whales to catch in their areas?
No, actually no. So the whale stocks were decreasing everywhere in the world, and Japan was also very hard afflicted by this. But the Japanese whalers, especially the coastal whalers, the large type coastal whalers, they tried to hide these facts from the IWC and from their own fishery agency. So they forged false records. They hunted whales they were not allowed to hunt. They gave wrong indications about how large these whales were. And all of this was very clandestine and a secret that was shared in the community itself, but was not allowed to give to the fishery agency or the IWC. Nevertheless, it was becoming more and more clear that this couldn't go on forever. And by the 1970s, all large type coastal whaling organizations were not making any profit anymore. So the signs were clear that this could not go on forever.
The global whale stocks already decreased before, and we have also a question from our audience asking if the disappearance was like slowly. And I also wonder if now with the moratorium that has been in place, I think for more than 30 years, could whale stocks already recover?
So the whale stocks began to decrease very rapidly after the introduction of industrial whaling, even before with the traditional whaling, as I said. We see some changes in the whale behavior, but especially since industrial whaling in the 1910s and later in the 1930s, 40s, whale stocks were really decreasing very rapidly. And today, about 14% of the whale biomass remains in the ocean, meaning that over 86% of whales that have once lived, also at least their biomass, is no longer in our ocean. So it has really depleted a lot. Have they recovered in the last 30 years? Yes and no. Some stocks have recovered. We have the very good indications. This is also one reason why the Japanese government says it's now safe to hunt them again, while other stocks really seems to struggle and not really get over the threshold that we would like to see. But we also have to say that it's very difficult to know how many whales there really are in the ocean. This is all guesswork. Even today, mostly you are counting whales by spotting them from ships and counting them one by one, and this is not very efficient. So there are huge discrepancies of how many whales there are in the oceans. The Japanese say there are much more, the IWC or some member states say there are much less. So this is an ongoing debate.
So do we know by today what impact this had, the disappearance of the biggest predators in the oceans?
This is something that is very a hot topic now among ecologists and marine biologists. We only slowly see what the impacts could have been. So there's a theory that the whales have influenced our ecosystems. They have fertilized whole regions of the ocean with their biomass, and brought certain fish species to certain places and made the whole ocean more productive. So biodiversity and bioproductivity was much higher, at least that's the working theory at the moment, when whales were still around than this is today. But as I said, this is very recent. These are very recent publications, and we don't know how much of this actually affected this planet.
So whaling in Japan, as you previously mentioned, gave a lot of international attention. Was this also a domestic political issue? And is there still this kind of pro-whaling policy? And are there a lot of subsidies going into the sector to keep it alive?
Yes, so this is, of course, something very deep into the politics of Japan. One thing to note, most Japanese political parties are actually pro-whaling. So even the opposition is not against whaling. But the battle lines in Japan itself is not between political parties, but between the different ministries. So the fishery agency is taking here a very step forward with their whaling program. So they have jobs on the line. If whaling is abolished, then they have to give up a whole section of the fishery agency, which is concerned with whaling, and they would lose money from the government. And also the fishery agency has tried to use whaling as a way to get into international topics and make their own policy agenda on the international stage against the foreign ministry. So the foreign ministry and the fishery agency are fighting over the whaling issue, and there are inside the Japanese government or the bureaucracy battles about this. But other than that, most people are behind these decisions, at least in the politics.
Okay, so you mentioned the sector is heavily subsidized. Maybe if we compare the whaling sector with the fishery sectors, can you say something about the revenues?
Yes, I can do that. I have prepared something for this when I share my screen once again. As you can see, whaling in the year 2018, so before it became, again, commercial whaling, 1 year before, we had about 250 employees and subsidies of about 7.7 million francs. And this is the very conservative date. Others say it's up to 50 million francs per year that was subsidized Japanese whaling. So I took the conservative amount. And the consumption per head in Japan of whale meat was about 50 grams. So each Japanese ate about 50 grams of whale meat, if you put it statistically. Fisheries at the same time has about 200,000 people that are employed in Japan. So you can see there's a massive difference in how many people are actually concerned by this. And we also see that the revenue is with 12 billion francs much higher. And also Japanese people eat about 24 kilograms of fish each year. And we can also compare this to whale watching, which is also popular in Japan in recent years. You can see that the industry is about the same size as whaling. There are about 189 people employed in whaling in 30 different companies. They make a revenue of 8 million per year, and over 200,000 people each year participate in whale watching in Japan.
Thank you very much for sharing this. So we have received some further questions from the audience, and I would just like to take up 2 more. So internationally, there were these anti-whaling movements. Was there also a debate within the country and some anti-whaling movements?
Yes, so there are much less anti-whaling organizations in Japan than there is internationally. For example, the WWF, which is very famous worldwide as being one of the largest NGOs, has a Japan section, of course. And the Japan section of the WWF is actually not talking much about Japanese whaling because they have large money giver in the background, large Japanese companies, and they do not want that the WWF is speaking about Japanese whaling, so they are not allowed to touch on this topic very much. That being said, there are some smaller NGOs in Japan. There's the so-called ICAN, which is Ikura, Iruka, Kujira Action Network, so the names for dolphin and whale in Japanese. And this is a very small NGO. It only has about, I think, 4 or 5 fixed members. And they have reported since the 1990s about the dolphin hunts in Japan. And it was actually them that has brought these dolphin hunts to the attention of the international audience. And as a result of the video footage they took, this whole Taichi, the cove thing was discovered internationally, and the cove was made. As you might know, in this movie and this documentary, Japanese dolphin hunts are very, very heavily criticized and shown as very barbaric. And this has actually been really hurtful for the ICAN network, for the Japanese NGOs, because the Japanese government blames them for bringing this up into the international arena. And since then, they have lost all their opportunities to speak with Japanese government officials, and they are much less powerful than they have been before this, before the cove was made.
You earlier mentioned that Japan nowadays is hunting about 300 whales a year, and this seems to be a very small number compared to what other nations, and including Japan, hunted in the 60s or before. So does this kind of mean that the fight over Japan whaling is more or less over, and that we can assume that the industry will anyway disappear in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yes, this is one interpretation of the data. You could say that that these 300 whales that are hunted is really not much. For example, 25 sei whales, even if they are endangered, from a conservation standpoint, it is not really making much difference. It is estimated that over 10,000 whales are dying each year because of anthropogenic reasons, ship collisions, noise, underwater noise, pollution, entanglements in fisher nets. So much more whales are dying each year because of what we are doing in our seas than actually whale hunting. And as I said, the subsidies were about 7 million francs before commercial whaling was reintroduced. Now it's unclear if there will be subsidies in the future, because commercial should be without subsidies, of course. So there is the interpretation that Japan has only reintroduced commercial whaling so that it can die off a few years later without Japan losing face of having given in to international pressure. So that in maybe 10, 15 years, there will be no Japanese whaling left. But there are also other interpretations, of course.
So let's move on to discuss further some of the geopolitical aspects you touched upon. So the US has played a particular role in Japan, and I would like to briefly share with you a TV commentary from 1946.
Japan's whaling fleet, by permission of General MacArthur's administration, is on the move again in the Antarctic. The whale hunt will help alleviate Japan's food shortage and ultimately save over $20 billion for American taxpayers. Not exactly porterhouse steak, but mighty welcome to a hungry nation.
So as you mentioned in your presentation, after the Second World War, the United States gave permission to Japan to do hunting in the Antarctica, also to feed their people. Could you give us a bit more background information on the role the United States has played in whaling in Japan, not only for Japan to to become a member of the International Whaling Commission, but also in negotiations within the Commission, and finally on Japan's decision to leave the organization?
Yeah, so the American and Japanese relationship since the very beginning in the 1850s was always also about whaling. So Japan was closed for 250 years from the rest of the world until the Americans appeared in 1853 and wanted Japan to be opened for the American whaling industry. So even then it started. Then after the Second World War, as mentioned, it was the American occupation force who allowed the Japanese to conduct whaling once again to feed the nation. And they also pressured Japan to adopt the regulation of the IWC, even though Japan was not part of the IWC in 1946. And when the American occupation ended in 1951, Japan joined the IWC immediately, because they were at this time still seen as the aggressor of Second World War, of course, and were not allowed to join the UN. So the Japanese thought that if they would join an international organization like the IWC, they could show the world that they are participating with all the others and they are in agreement with international law and stuff like this, which they didn't do during the Second World War. So the joining of the IWC for the Japanese was very important for international recognition. Moving forward to the 1980s, as said, the IWC, America gave up their whaling policies and they forbade import of whale products into the US in 1970. And in the 1980s, they really wanted to push this commercial moratorium on whaling in the IWC, the US. And Japan was giving an objection to this moratorium in 1982, saying that it would not abide to this moratorium. And this was their right as a member state of the IWC. So the US Reagan administration at that time pressured Japan to withdraw their objection to the moratorium so that they would be bound by the moratorium, by claiming that, or by saying that if Japan would not withdraw this their objection to the moratorium, the Japanese would no longer be allowed to fish in the seas, in the economic zone of America, where Japan was fishing at the time. So Japan was pressured to give up their objection and be bound by the moratorium. And when they did this, they said, okay, but instead we want to do a scientific whaling. And this was not taken well by the Reagan administration, who then shut out Japan completely from the exclusive economic zone. So since 1985 or 6, I think, Japan is no longer allowed to do fishing in the American waters. And they had already removed their objection to the moratorium. So they were also not allowed to do commercial whaling. So the Japanese lost both whaling and fisheries. And of course, this was a very hot point of contention against the US, and Japanese politicians saw this as a kind of, the US as a kind of traitor in this incident.
Japan was not the only country objecting the moratorium. Also Norway and Iceland, as you mentioned, continued commercial whaling. Did this also lead to this international attention and controversy?
Yes, so Iceland and Norway also objected to the moratorium and was also pressured by the US to withdraw the moratorium, but unlike Japan, they did not give in to the pressure. So Norway remains a member state that has objected and that is legally allowed to do commercial whaling. Iceland, on the other hand, did withdraw from the IWC and joined later. And because it joined later, it is also not bound by the moratorium. And the Japanese criticized that only they get all the heat for continuing whaling, while Iceland and Norway are also doing whaling. And this is because, according to the Japanese, because of racism. The Europeans and America would criticize Japan because they are not a European nation and not Western, only because they are Asians, and they see it as a kind of Japan bashing, as they call it.
So in the 70s, a lot of also non-whaling countries joined the organization, including Switzerland. Do you know when and why Switzerland joined and what role you have played? Also, I know last week was the first meeting without Japan as a member. You couldn't participate, but maybe you can also share some insights you heard from this meeting.
Yeah, so Switzerland joined in, I think, 1980, originally also to oppose whaling, as many nations have joined during this time period to be against whaling. But in the meantime, Switzerland has taken a more lenient way. It is not pro-whaling, it's not against whaling. It tries to find a compromise that everyone can agree on, at least that it has tried to do this in the last few years. This has also been criticized, of course. But unlike Germany, who is really strong anti-whaling, Switzerland tries to talk with all parties involved and find a common ground among them. It was actually the vote of Switzerland who allowed in 2002 that Iceland could come back to the IWC without having to agree to the moratorium, which you could also argue, if you want, this was not a good thing, or it was a good thing. So as I said, currently the IWC is meeting, but not the political commission of the IWC, but the scientific commission. So there are two commissions that meet each year, and the scientific commission is concerned with providing new data about the whale stocks and other things. And as I said, it's the first time that the Japanese are not there as a member state, but as observers. And it's all virtual at the moment. And what I've seen so far is that Japan is not really participating in these discussions about the scientific whale stocks and so on. At least in the commissions I'm sitting in, there seem to be less activity of the Japanese than there have been in previous years. But it's too early to really say what the difference will be.
Maybe let me take up just one more question that came in from the audience before we move on to the last part. This person is asking whether Iceland has only been hunting unthreatened whale species, unlike Japan, if this is really the case.
I'm not an expert from Iceland, but from what I think I remember, no, Iceland has also been hunting whale stocks that are protected by the IWC moratorium, and they have been selling some of these whales to Japan, actually, because they were allowed to hunt them, unlike the Japanese. So the Japanese have imported whale meat from Iceland to Japan. So this has been happening in the past, and there is a very famous Icelandic whaler which speaks very openly about being pro-whaling and everything like that, and he's also a very controversial figure in the scene. So this is what I know about Iceland.
As we only have 10 minutes left, as mentioned, I would like to move on to the last part. I'd be very much interested in hearing more about the research you did in today's whaling towns. Could you maybe give us a brief overview of today's situation in these towns? Maybe present one or two cases you have looked at.
I can do that. As you can see here, we have these 4 whaling towns. Nowadays, there are more. In the recent 30 years, more and more communities in Japan have discovered their roots as whaling towns, meaning that they had at some point in the past done whaling. So, for example, Shimonoseki in the southwest or Hachinohe in the north are also all claiming to have roots in whaling. Taiji is the most famous one, as I said, but I want to focus here on Ayukawa, which is a town in northern Japan, which only started whaling in 1906. And it's also the town I have researched the most. And I have found out that before 1906, the people in Ayukawa were against whaling. They had a very strong anti-whaling attitude. They saw whales as protectors, as the seas of the god who protected the community and brought fish closer to the shore. And only in 1906 did they begin to do whaling when whalers from Western Japan arrived in this region. What is also interesting about Ayukawa, you see it here, it was completely destroyed 2011 by the tsunami, the Sanriku tsunami, and about 80% of the town nowadays is destroyed. And also the whaling station that was there was destroyed. The whaling ship you see here in the forefront was recovered was salvaged after the tsunami, and now the whole town is getting up again, and they are focusing all their reconstruction work on whaling, because they think only if the whole town is becoming a whaling town again, people will move to this town again. They have lost about 70% of their inhabitants, and they want to attract tourists. So everything they are rebuilding now is entangled to this whaling industry, even though the local whaling company, Ayukawa Hoge, has been not making profits in, I think, in over 20 years. So it's very unclear and very, I would say, also dangerous that they focus so much on industry that might die out in a few years.
So how did the local whalers react to Japan's decision to take up commercial whaling again? Were they surprised?
With the people I talked with the whalers, they were very surprised because they were not told beforehand, apparently. Maybe some were, but at least the ones I talked with, they were not. And they were actually quite happy, many of them at least, in the first instance, that they were happy with this. They have waited for 30 years that they can now hunt minke whales again. As I said, this was very important for them. But there were also some concerns. For example, people in Ayukawa were concerned that now other bigger cities would start whaling. As I said, Shimonoseki, Hachinohe are much larger towns who are now also discovering their whaling routes, and that a small town like Ayukawa with some 1,000 inhabitants cannot compete with these large towns with 200,000 people living there. So that they're so in the last 30 years, Ayukawa was mostly famous for continuing this whaling tradition, and now other players are coming in, and this could be the end of these small whaling towns. So this is one concern they now have.
So do you think that whaling is a good option for the socioeconomic development of these towns, or are there any other options whalers and also the government look into? For example, I don't know, an alternative could be whale watching.
To stay on the case of Ayukawa never had a whale watching industry, unlike other whaling towns. So it was never taken up there. I think the reason is that the whales are too much out into the ocean, so it would take too long to get there. So this is not really an option there. If it makes sense socioeconomically, I can't really say. There is not much there you could do otherwise. Today, whaling is something very local, very intimate. There are whaling festivals where people meet and do some rituals together. And this, of course, should also attract other people from other regions, but it should also show that the communities are brought together with these festivals. So it might make sense in the micro level that some people do this for the community itself, but on a macro level, I don't think whaling will come back so soon.
So I would like to take up one more question from the audience. So I know you tried once before whale meat. How does it taste? And is there still a demand for the meat? And what happens with all this meat? Is it just stored in freezers? Who eats it?
Yeah, as I said, about 50 grams is eaten by a person every year, which is not much. However, this is very different according to region. So in the whaling towns itself, much more whale meat is eaten than in other regions. For example, Ayukawa and the surrounding communities are, I think, about 10 to 20% of all the whale meat in Japan are eaten there in this town. I have tried it. I had to try it. If you want to do interviews with whalers, you have to prove that you're not from Greenpeace if you're coming from the West. And the ritual they have is that you have first to eat some whale meat and then you can do the interview. Otherwise, it does not work. So I've tried it. It's okay. You can eat it. It's something between fish and horse, I would say. I don't think humanity would lose anything if it's no longer eaten. It's not particularly good, but of course, something like this is always subjective. You can buy it in some stores in Tokyo and in these whaling towns, as I said. And there are some talks about bringing it back to the school cantinas in some places so that the new generation of Japanese children eat this and have good memories of this when they grow up. but it's also said that there are about 4,000 tons of frozen whale meat somewhere in Tokyo, which the Japanese government cannot sell because there's no demand for it. If this is true or not is unclear, however.
Thank you very much also for sharing your personal experience. So to round off the discussion, I would like to ask you one final question. So what do these developments and the cultural and historical factors we have been talking about for the last 45 minutes tell us about Japan as a nation in change? And what are the aspects you still do not understand about whaling in Japan?
Yeah, it is very strange, this whole whaling discussion in Japan. For the one hand, the Japanese are very much focused on data, always data, 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 saying everything they do is scientific. They have looked at all the whale stocks. It is clear that whaling can be done. The West is completely emotional, irrational with their conservation ideology, as they say it, because it's clear that you could do whaling without hurting the stocks. This is the official Japanese response. So on the one hand, it's very data-based, and on the other hand, it's very emotional. So many Japanese get very emotional. I did discuss this before I started any of my research. I discussed the whaling topic with a Japanese friend in a cafe. And when we began to discuss these whaling debates, she did stand up in the cafe and began screaming at me how I'm a Western imperialist and stuff like that. And this has never happened to me before, especially not in Japan, where the people are very considerate normally. And it was very strange for me to experience such an emotional response to a topic like this. So for me personally, it's really hard to get why there is this difference between relying so much on data and being so emotional about the topic on the same time. And I think this might say something about Japan, but we also have to remember that many countries have topics like this. For example, gun laws in the US, or Autobahn discussions, speed limits in Germany. So there seems to be a tendency that some countries have these national topics which other countries just can't understand.
Thank you very much, Fynn. I think this is a good point to end today's conversation. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and your experience in doing research in Japan. And also thank you everyone for joining today and for submitting great questions as always. And I'm looking forward to see you at another Asian Society webcast soon.